Hi, my name is Tom Conkle. I'm a cybersecurity engineer with Optic Cyber Solutions. I wanted to talk a few minutes today about CMMC and just provide an overview of CMMC 2.0. Before we get too far into an overview of what is CMMC 2.0, I wanted to talk about the genesis or what led to CMMC 2.0 being created. It was a culmination of an 8-month working group that started back in March of 2021 and was finished and released on November 4th of the same year. The working group that was a collection of senior executives from throughout DoD were giving several guidelines from looking at the CMMC program overall to see how it should evolve. And as we see here on this slide, we have 5 of the primary goals that were issued to DoD. The first one being safeguard sensitive information to enable and protect the warfighter. So we can see here that the DoD's primary interest is in maintaining the confidentiality of their data that they're giving to the DIB members to process and use in support of the contract to help the DoD. We know from a cybersecurity program, we typically talk about the cybersecurity triad as confidentiality, availability, and integrity. However, we notice here that we really are just focused on the confidentiality. It doesn't mean that the DoD isn't interested in the availability and the integrity of their data over the systems that are processing their data. It just means that confidentiality has a higher requirement, and that's really where we want to focus on that. The DoD understands that most businesses, right, have to maintain the integrity of their systems and the availability of the systems to meet their contractual goals and, well, quite frankly, to stay in business, right? So they're not going to micromanage or tell us exactly what we need to do for this availability integrity requirements, but from the confidentiality standpoint, they want to make sure that we're on the same page so that we can protect that DoD information appropriately. One of the other goals with CMMC 2.0 was to enhance the DIB cybersecurity overall based on evolving threats, basically making sure that expectations were understood, right? The requirements of the DoD, again, for protecting the confidentiality of their data was understood by DIB members so that they can implement the appropriate procedures and processes to protect that data. The third goal was to maintain accountability and to minimize barriers for compliance. Barriers are typically seen as cost barriers within CMMC, right? The cost associated with implementing a cybersecurity program may be, depending on the size of the organization, type of organization, can delay or cause issues with meeting those goals. So they wanted to help provide more flexibility in 2.0 to allow organizations to implement the protections that are required the way that made sense for them, but increase that accountability, right? So making sure that the DIB companies themselves, senior executives specifically within those DIB companies, are accountable for the cybersecurity program and meeting the DoD requirements. The next goal that we see here is to contribute towards instilling a collaborative culture of cybersecurity and cyber resilience. So basically wanted to make sure that CMMC is a mechanism that we can use for an open dialogue and understanding, how are those protections being met, making sure that we understand what the requirements and expectations are for a cybersecurity program and enable that communication. And that directly leads into the last goal here that we see is for maintaining public trust through high professional and ethical standards, right? So if we have that collaborative culture, we're talking, we're being honest with each other, what expectations are, what we're doing, how we're protecting that data, right? CMMC can help, maintain the confidentiality of the DoD systems while enabling the collaboration and the trust within the DIB providers themselves. So those were the 5 primary goals that were given to the working group as they went in, and they also took into account all of the feedback that they had from the first initial versions of CMMC. So there were over 850 comments that were received during the rulemaking process for the previous versions of CMMC that were taken into consideration, as well as many forums that were used to provide feedback. And one of the most common messages that were received in all of the comments was that the DIB members had cybersecurity capabilities, right? That in order for them to stay in business, they had to maintain again, the availability of their system. They have intellectual property that needs to be protected, so they were protecting that data already on their own and only needed CMMC to provide that additional guidance as to where DoD would require additional focus. So one of the biggest premises for CMMC 2.0 is that it is building on the good cybersecurity capabilities that the DIB members have already reported that they have in place, right? So we want to take that initial foundation, those capabilities that are already in place, and then add CMMC 2.0 on top of that to ensure the confidentiality of the systems are maintained. Okay, so let's talk a little bit then about what does CMMC 2.0 look like. Those of you that are familiar with the previous versions of CMMC will first notice is that we have changed from 5 levels of maturity to 3 levels of maturity. That's primarily because in the previous version, level 2 and level 4 were considered transition levels and never really meant to be certification levels. No organization was ever going to be certified at level 2 or 4. They were just meant to help prioritize workloads so that as you were coming up through the maturity, you understood where you should prioritize your work as you get to the next level. That was causing a lot of confusion in the community. People didn't understand why 2 and 4 were there. So to help eliminate that confusion, and because certifications weren't going to be issued at those levels anyway, DoD has removed them. So we now have a 3-point scale where level 1 aligns to what previously was level 1. Level 2 aligns to what was previously level 3, and level 3 aligns to what was previously level 5. So let's take a deeper look into each of these levels and understand what they mean. Level 1 is still the foundational level, still includes the 17 practices from the original version of CMMC, and those are the practices that were identified from the FARs and are pulled out of 800-171 as well. For level 1 organizations, or organizations that are only processing federal contract information, or FCI, are required to be at level 1, and they're required to do annual self-assessment. So there's no longer the requirement for the third-party assessment at level 1. This is an annual self-assessment, but if we think back to the goals that we had, we wanted to maintain that accountability. So they have added a requirement in CMMC 2.0 that a senior executive, a board member, or C-suite will have to sign off on that self-assessment to attest that the cybersecurity capabilities are in place as appropriate to meet those 17 practices. For organizations that are processing controlled unclassified information, or CUI, they're going to be required to meet level 2 or the advanced level. This level has 110 practices that are aligned directly from 800-171. And as we know, 800-171 was tailored by NIST by looking at 853 security controls and pulling out those controls that are necessary for protecting the confidentiality of CUI. So it makes perfect sense that version 2 of CMMC would align to 171. The assessment process for level 2 is bifurcated in 2.0, and basically what this means that if you have high prioritized CUI or using a contract or have a contract that has CUI data that might have an adversary might be more interested in seeking out that information, right? So you're a higher priority or higher prioritized contract, you're required to have a third-party assessment once every 3 years to verify that the 110 security practices are in place. If you don't have a higher priority contract and you're just processing CUI, in those cases, then an annual assessment may be necessary or may be appropriate. Again, the annual assessment would have to be signed off by a senior executive in the company, and the procurements themselves will tell us if we have a prioritized contract or not, so that we know whether we need that third-party assessment or if a self-assessment will be appropriate. Okay. At level 3, or the expert level, it's going to have a requirement for the initial 800-171 practices, so all 110 requirements from 171 will be included, and we know that there will be a subset of 800-172 requirements that will be added in. Level 3 is still being defined, so we don't know exactly what those requirements for 172 will be, but 172 is available if we want to get a sense as to what kind of capabilities might be required if we're at that expert level or level 3. If we do have those advanced requirements in our contracts that we need to be at level 3, in those cases, we will be required to be certified by the government every 3 years. So here we can talk about some of the other updates from the model outside of just the maturity level. One of the other changes that are within 2.0 is the process maturity is no longer going to be included in the assessment itself. Basically going back to industry, and DoD heard loud and clear that industry knows how to implement capabilities. They know what policies are required. They know what effective procedures look like to make for their organization. And of course, organizations of different sizes may have different levels of formality or requirements from what procedures look like. So ultimately, it's not how we are meeting the requirements, it is, are we meeting the requirements that's going to be assessed. So your organization is able to implement the capabilities that make sense for you to ensure that the practices are in place, and that is what will be assessed. As we talked about, the practices themselves are directly aligned at level 2 to 171, and at level 3 will include some of 172 requirements. In the previous version of CMMC, there was what was referred to as the Delta 20 controls. And basically these were 20 extra practices that were added in CMMC to help drive focus into other areas of a cybersecurity program. Basically, the Delta 20 included things like monitoring audit logs. Well, again, industry told DoD, we're already doing that. Why are you worried about that? Monitoring audit logs obviously does affect the security of the system, but doesn't directly attribute back to the confidentiality of the data. So those Delta 20 practices have basically been realigned back to the organization, saying you're responsible for making sure that you're doing those things, and we know you are because you have a sound business and you want to stay in business, so we're not going to assess those. We're only going to assess the requirements that are directly protecting the confidentiality of that CUI information at level 2. Okay. Another big change with 2.0 is the inclusion of POAMs. Previous versions said that we had to have a POAM process. We had to be able to work through and make sure POAMs were being addressed, but we weren't allowed to have any POAM items listed within our POAMs. That has changed with 2.0. You can have some POAMs in place. However, there are requirements as to what could be put on the POAM. So they're saying that some of the highest scored requirements will not be allowed to be put on the POAM. A little unclear is exactly what the highest scored requirements will be. We can kind of infer that from the SPRS worksheets that's out today, and we know that some of the 171 requirements has been labeled as level 5 points. There's some that are labeled as 3 points and some as 1. So we could infer that the 5-point requirements may be those ones that wouldn't be allowed to be on the POAM, but that's unclear at this time, and we're waiting for the additional guidance to find out exactly which ones cannot be on the POAM list. We do know that if you do put things on the POAM, that we still have to make sure that we meet a minimum score. So in other words, not only can we not have the highest rated requirements on the POAM, you're not allowed to put everything else on, right? You have to have some capabilities actually in place to meet a minimum score. Again, not exactly sure what that minimum score is at this point, but the new guidance will be out hopefully soon so that we know what we can put on there. But we also know that anything that is on the POAM has to be closed within 180 days of contract award. So we have to show that due diligence, the effort to make sure that we are working to implement those capabilities from the POAM. Another change with CMMC 2.0 is the inclusion of waivers. There were no waivers in the initial versions of CMMC, but now the DoD has given themselves the ability to look at specific procurements, grants, and say, yes, there is CUI data in this, but it really doesn't make sense to go through CMMC. So CMMC 2.0 as a whole can be waived. They're not going to waive specific practices, but the entire requirement for CMMC 2 may be waived. And they will be strictly time bound, so that we might waive it for the first 6 months or the first year of a contract. And we know that the waivers have to be approved by senior DoD officials, right? Not just within the procurement team itself, but within DoD. So this is going to go up to a high level, making sure that we understand why the waiver is going to be put in place, why CMMC wouldn't be required for this contract before it's authorized. So DoD is expecting there will be a minimal number of waivers, however, that might be available to some contracts where appropriate. So what is the net effect of all of CMMC 2.0 changes? As we know, the DFAR rule came into effect in November of 2020 that implemented the previous version of CMMC. That rule is still in effect and is not going to be changed until the rulemaking for 2.0 completes. 2.0 is going through the same rulemaking process that CMMC 1 took, so we do expect the DFARs to be updated in any time from 9 to 24 months from now, depending on how many comments are received from the public comment periods and other processes of making sure that we're appropriately adjudicating 2.0 before it's put in. In the meantime, though, the current DFAR says that the previous version of CMMC is required when listed in a procurement. So DoD has said they're just not going to include it in a procurement. That way we can meet the DFAR requirement without having to implement CMMC 1.02 at this point. And also the government has said that for those organizations that want to get a jump start on 2.0 while it's going through the rulemaking process, they're looking for ways to provide incentives to help you if you voluntarily go through certification. So more to come on what that will look like, what kind of incentives will be provided from that. Some of the other things to keep in mind is from the DFAR standpoint, again, the requirement for organizations to complete the supplier performance risk system is still in place. That doesn't go away. So for right now, while we're going through the 2.0 rulemaking process, organizations are required to have a current SPRS worksheet uploaded to the SPRS system itself. And again, 2.0 will not show up in any contractual requirements until after the rulemaking process is completed and it's officially added to DFARS. We just wanted to take a few moments today to provide a quick overview on 2.0. All of the information that we've talked about was taken directly from the DoD's Undersecretary of Defense Acquisition and Sustainment from them or from the CMMC accreditation body directly. There is a lot of misinformation at the moment within CMMC 2.0 and what it means, so be cautious as to where the information you're getting it from is. The CMMC AB and the Acquisition and Sustainment offices are the sources of truth, if you will, and where you should rely on your information. You see the link here for that. Optic does have a few resources available on our resource homepage, including a 171 profile. If you wanted to get started on defining or documenting your cybersecurity program and helping establish, basically the profile becomes a management tool so that you understand the capabilities that you have in place as it relates to the 171 requirements and can identify if you have gaps or where enhancements need to be put in place so that you know if you're ready for CMMC 2.0. We also have a worksheet for the SPRS worksheet to help with the scoring of that process. And you see here the portal for uploading that and some guidance from NIST for 171, 172, and 171A, or the assessment guidance that organizations can use to understand how 171 requirements will be assessed. So again, my name is Tom Conkle. If you have any questions, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you.